In 1811, Thomas Douglas, the 5th Earl of Selkirk and a shareholder in the Hudson's Bay Company, created the Red River Colony on a tract of land granted him by the Baymen. The well-meaning Selkirk was deeply troubled by the plight of his fellow Scotsmen during the Highland clearances, a time when many poor Scottish farmers were evicted from their land by their own clan chiefs and were replaced with sheep. However, in spite of Selkirk's good intentions, his ignorance of the people who already lived near the Red River would plunge his countrymen into yet more trouble. Much of the area brought under the Red River Colony was already home to the Métis and First Nations, who were furious about the building of this new settlement on their land. So the very existence of the colony was extremely problematic. The area of the Red River Colony consisted of 300,000 square kilometres of land, 5 times the size of Scotland, including parts of modern-day Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Ontario, Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. The colony would get off to an inauspicious start, with starvation during the first and very harsh winter. Miles MacDonell, the colony's governor, would be the one to spark all-out war on the prairie when he passed the Pemmican Proclamation in 1814. This proclamation was so called because it banned the export of pemmican along with other provisions from the area of the Red River Colony. The region's bison population had been dwindling due to hunting by the Métis, indigenous peoples, and now the new settlers. Therefore, the proclamation prioritized Selkirk settlers having enough food to survive, but completely disregarded the Métis' reliance on exporting pemmican to supply the Nor'westers. When the Métis refused to abide to the proclamation, MacDonell aimed at enforcing it with a blockade of the waterways used by the Northwest Company, aka the Nor'westers, to access the supply of pemmican. Meanwhile, Lord Selkirk was gathering an army of Baymen and Swiss mercenaries to protect his settlers from the threat of the increasingly militant Métis. For the Métis, the proclamation was the final straw. First, their land had been claimed by Selkirk settlers, and now the new governor was demanding that they give up their way of life in order to secure enough food for the invaders. In an attempt to avoid violence, in 1815, the Northwest Company made the alluring promise of safe passage for Selkirk settlers to Upper Canada, an opportunity which many fearful settlers tried to take. However, Archibald MacDonald, who was temporarily standing in as governor while MacDonell was away, prevented the settlers from leaving with cannon. Greatly angered by MacDonald's threats, some settlers deserted anyway, and gave the Nor'westers a number of arms which they had stolen out of spite for MacDonald. Throughout 1815, the situation continued to escalate, with native warriors and Métis raiding the Red River Colony. Therefore, Alexander MacDonell of the Northwest Company decided to begin taking serious action against the colony with his small army of armed voyageurs and Métis. This motley force encamped west of the Red River on Frog Plain. A battery of cannon in the Nor'westers' camp prevented any boats from coming to or leaving the colony. A prominent leader of the Métis was Cuthbert Grant, whose Scottish father was a member of Clan Grant of Strathspey and whose mother was part Cree or Assiniboine. On the 10th of June, shots were fired by the settlers and Métis, but no blood was spilt. The Nor'westers proceeded to steal the colony's cattle and fired on those settlers who attempted to recover the livestock. With a hostile force on their doorstep, many more settlers deserted the colony, and some houses were even torched by Métis war parties. In June, the Métis and Nor'westers attacked the colony 4 times, while the remaining settlers and Baymen put up a futile resistance. On the 16th of June, the day after the settlers' horses were driven off, Governor Miles MacDonell agreed to surrender to the Northwest Company. The terms of the verbal treaty were quite generous, and included allowing the Red River Colony to keep 200 bags of pemmican. The Nor'westers also agreed to supply the colony with 175 bags of pemmican during the winter. However, the Métis were not content with this outcome, as they wanted the colony gone, so they resumed firing at the colonists. With no choice other than annihilation, the colonists finally agreed to the Métis' demands to dismantle their colony. On the 24th of June, the Métis burned down the empty settlement of the Red River Colony and Fort Douglas, a Hudson's Bay Company post which was nearby. In retaliation for the burning of Fort Douglas, and in order to retrieve the colony's stolen arms, a group of baymen temporarily seized Fort Gibraltar of the Northwest Company. The new governor of the Red River Colony was a man called Robert Semple. He was uninterested in keeping to the agreement the colonists had made with the Métis, so in November 1815 he led 160 settlers and baymen in rebuilding the colony. In 1816, Semple and his men dismantled Fort Gibraltar so it could never be used by the Nor'westers as a point from which to strike the colony. The baymen also seized Fort Pembina, confiscating its arms and munitions. Meanwhile, Selkirk and his army was heading towards the colony. At the same time, the Nor'westers were also mobilizing forces, with the intention of destroying the colony once and for all. Cuthbert Grant's mounted party of 50 Métis and French-Canadian irregulars was sighted on Frog Plain in the late afternoon of the 19th of June, 1815. In response, the foolhardy Semple mustered a small force of 20 settlers and baymen to confront Grant's men. Allegedly, Semple told his men not to fire unless fired upon. However, it was reported by some witnesses that a few of the baymen boasted they would either take the Métis' provisions or kill them. The stage was set for the Battle of Seven Oaks. On Frog Plain, a French-Canadian clerk called François Firmin Boucher rode up to Semple. The clerk and Semple spoke briefly, but the conversation quickly deteriorated as Semple reached for the reins of Boucher's horse, or possibly his gun, in an attempt to arrest him. Seeing the scuffle break out, the dismounted Métis began firing at the governor and his party. Semple was the first to fall, and as his men rushed over to their fallen commander, they too were gunned down. In less than half an hour, Semple and his men were slaughtered by the numerically superior Métis, who were not in the mood for taking prisoners. Witnesses of the engagement on both sides claim that the other side had fired first, with the Nor'westers and Métis claiming that the first shot had been fired at Boucher. Only one Nor'wester was killed, which indicates that the battle was more of a massacre, or at the very least was extremely one-sided. The number of Métis casualties is unknown, but was probably negligible. After Semple's crushing defeat, the settlers fled from their colony once more. After the fight on Frog's Plain, the Pemmican War dragged on, with company forts switching hands and both sides confiscating each other's supplies. In January 1817, Fort Douglas was retaken by the baymen from a skeleton garrison of Nor'westers who were suffering from a lack of provisions. Earlier in August 1816, Selkirk had captured the Nor'westers' headquarters of Fort William, which was a major victory for the Hudson's Bay Company. In the June of 1819, the baymen blockaded the Grand Rapids Portage and succeeded in capturing a Nor'wester canoe brigade. However, when the baymen and Swiss soldiers were warned of the formidable Métis fast approaching, the blockade was abandoned. In 1821, after several years of bloodshed and destruction, the Pemmican War was finally brought to an end when pressure from the British government and declining profits forced both companies to merge under the name of the Hudson's Bay Company. Baymen and former Nor'westers now worked side by side with little animosity. With the bison population dwindling in the area of the Red River Colony, the Métis became increasingly reliant on farming crops by 1825 and lived in a state of neutral coexistence with the Red River settlers. In 1828, the baymen appointed Cuthbert Grant, their old enemy, as head of the Red River Colony's defense, and he would later become sheriff of Assiniboia District.